So continuing on with this conversation about security in the Arctic region and the various different actors that have an interest in the region, I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of an arms race and the possibility that we are maybe observing or about to be on the precipice of an arms race in the Arctic. And what has sparked this question for me, and I'll actually throw up a PDF version of this infographic that has much higher resolution so people can really zoom in and see the details if this is the kind of thing you're interested in. But what kind of sparked this conversation in recent years is an observation that there has been a lot of new icebreakers being commissioned by Russia, by Canada, and by the United States, as well as China and Norway. And icebreakers are essential to being able to operate in any serious capacity in the Arctic region, particularly heavy icebreakers. And so there's been lots of sort of wringing of hands that Russia has this large icebreaker fleet relative to the United States, which has a much smaller icebreaker fleet. And the reason why this might matter is, again, because in order to operate in a sort of sustained naval presence in the Arctic requires these special icebreakers to be able to operate, and suggesting that the spending might trigger a counterspending, right? As the United States increases its icebreaker fleet, will that cause Russia and others to increase their icebreaker fleet even more to enhance their ability to operate in these regions, which would be the classic sort of security dilemma, arms race kind of spiral. And so when we're trying to think about this question, a lot of the research that's been done on arms races dates back to the sort of post-World War I environment in which a physicist who was actually, I think he was a meteorologist, disciplines kind of blurred at the time, by the name of Richardson, sort of tried to think about how to build a system of equations that would explain the defense spending of states in relationship to each other, and try to understand what triggered an arms race that would cause states doubling down and increasing their spending. And Richardson essentially said that an arms race is a function of three things. It's driven by a fear of your rival's defense spending, right? And so you look at what your rival is spending and you see that they're increasing their spending, and therefore you feel that you need to increase your spending as well. It might not be a one-to-one. It might be, every dollar that my opponent spends, I'm going to spend 50 cents. Or it might be every dollar my opponent spends, I have to spend $2. So there's going to be some sort of relationship that your opponent's defense spending is going to spark a fear, and you're going to counter that in some way. A second is the political constraints, right? We live in the world in which you can't just sort of spend infinitely. There are realities that we face. And so the question is, so what are the opportunity costs, right? If you're taxing your population to spend on your military, does that take resources out of the private sector? Does that prevent people from being able to consume goods? Does that take money away from the social welfare state or other things that the state might want to spend money on? So what are those costs that come with increased military spending that might create sort of political pressure against that, and maybe slow it down, or maybe say, okay, we've spent enough, even though we're worried about our adversary or our rival, we can't make these kind of additional guns versus butter decisions to keep spending more. And then the final piece that Richardson says is going to drive this is a state's own greed or ambition or desire to sort of dominate the international system or change the status quo. That's going to set sort of a baseline level of military spending that's going to be augmented up or down by these other factors. And he tries to organize this into a system of equations. And when he has more than two states in his arms race model, it gets really complicated. There gets to be a lot of letters and symbols involved, and also the math gets really tricky. But in the short term, I think we can talk about what he's doing and how he's trying to think about this mathematically, using sort of a two-state arms race scenario where we have state A and state B. And so we have this sort of dx over dt, which is, I guess, the increase in the spending in state A's military spending compared to time, at time t, right? So we're talking about, are you increasing or decreasing that spending from where you were? And likewise for state B, they're increasing or decreasing. But those letters X and Y end up showing up in the equations as well, but in sort of the reverse piece. And so for state A, they're looking at the defense spending from state B, that's the Y value, and they're saying, wow, state B is spending, X billion dollars. What is my sort of level of fear that creates? And if that level of fear is positive, I'm going to spend a certain dollar amount to kind of counter that, right? And likewise for state B, the L times X means you're looking at state A's military spending, and your level of fear that evokes increases your own spending in some way, shape, or form. Then for every dollar that you spend, there's going to be sort of a political cost to that might kind of put the brakes on that. So that's the alpha X for state A. This is what's slowing it down, the economic and political costs. And then the final part of that equation is the state's individual sort of greed or ambition that might set a baseline level of spending. And so we have these various different equations, and they kind of feed back on each other, right? And so the question that became really interesting for Richardson is that feedback process in which state A increases its spending, and that creates fear for state B, and they increase their spending, which creates fear for state A, which causes them to increase, like that ongoing cycle that we describe as sort of an arms race. Does that sort of converge on a point where states realize, like, yeah, this is a good amount of defense spending, and we're happy with that? We would call that an equilibrium, where states are kind of maxed out. They've spent as much as they can spend, like they physically can spend, given the threat that they perceive. And even if the threat goes up, the additional costs of spending more are just too great to continue this arms race. Or does it not matter? Does an additional dollar of spending by an adversary create the intense need to counter that overrides everything else, and vice versa? And so we just kind of spiral on into the point where states are completely militarized and it's absorbed all excess spending of the state and then some. And so Richardson is interested in this question of do states converge on equilibrium, and he's also interested in how stable is that equilibrium, right? So you can find a point where like states are stable, but if I add one more dollar to another state's spending, is that going to set off an arms race, or is it going to, are states going to spend a little bit more and then realize, no, that was too much, and back off a little bit? And so these are questions that his system of equations seems pretty well able to kind of answer in a mathematical sense, but it ends up getting tricky when we start trying to assign actual values for some of the variables that are sort of country specific. We can certainly measure dollars spent on a military for states, but in terms of how much fear a particular level of military spending evokes in another state, that's hard to know. And so we've had studies that have tried to estimate this, looking at diplomatic data. Do you have shared international organization membership, that kind of thing, or looking at trade data suggesting that states that are trading more are less likely to view each other's military spending as a threat. And so that might be a way to kind of get a sense of what those numbers look like. In trying to get a sense of the alpha and the beta, the sort of brakes that slow down military spending, some people have said, well, you need to look at macroeconomic growth models and, ask the economists, if you spend $1 on your military, how much is that going to decrease or increase your economic growth? Maybe that's an important part of the story. Other people have said, well, it's easier for maybe authoritarian regimes to spend more on their military than it is for democracies, where people have demands for things that are not more fighter jets, and dislike being taxed to pay for more fighter jets, that maybe those breaks are greater in a democracy than they would be in an authoritarian regime. But at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter quite as much that we are measuring those things precisely. What Richardson tells us is that what really matters is the ratio. That what matters if you're going to reach an equilibrium is whether that K divided by alpha, so your fear level divided by your brake level, ends up being positive, greater than 1 or less than 1. Because if your fear exceeds your kind of resistance to more spending, you can get an arms race that explodes out into indefinite military spending. Whereas if the brake level exceeds the fear level, you're likely to find an equilibrium point where you're going to stop and say, okay, this is a reasonable amount of spending given the security concerns that I have and given the constraints that I'm facing. All that having been said, there's a lot we don't actually know about this model in terms of how well it maps to the real world, and some conceptual reasons to think that maybe this isn't a perfectly efficient way to think about an arms race. So one of the things that Richardson sort of assumes is that the consequences of arms expenditure are going to actually provide security, but are otherwise not a good thing for a state, right? That there's a guns versus butter trade-off. And that's not always the case. Certainly, if you are a client of a superpower, you can increase your military by simply asking the superpower client to give you or subsidize your armaments, and you may not have any domestic costs, and it actually may make your regime more secure, both from internal threats and from external threats. A military regime may actually find that spending more on the military ends up strengthening the military as an institution within society, which further strengthens the legitimacy, maybe not the legitimacy, the authority and hold the regime has on power. Maybe that's a positive thing. And even if there's, a consequence of, it slows down economic growth, maybe that's far less of a concern. And so we actually should be thinking about this not as a brake, but as an accelerator in some circumstances. And then we really don't know if the effect is constant, right? We don't know. And this goes for all of the parameters, right? In terms of the threat level or the brake level. We don't know if that increases after a certain point. We don't know if, it tapers off at a certain point. We don't know if there's like a step function, like you're fine until you build an aircraft carrier, and then suddenly my level of fear sort of skyrockets. There's a lot that we don't necessarily know about how these variables that we sort of put in these equations, or Richardson tells us we can put in these equations, how they actually operate in reality. And so I think that's one of the wrinkles to wrestle with when we're thinking about, are we on the brink of an arms race in the Arctic, is we have these sort of three things that we think help us to make sense of this, but do they actually apply, right? Does the ambition that states have, does the brakes on spending, and does the fear of an adversary spending, do those things apply in the Arctic in the same way as they might apply in other arenas? And to add just another layer of sort of, uncertainty or messiness around this, not all military spending is necessarily going to evoke the same kind of fear response. And so this is a table that was developed by Robert Jervis in one of his famous articles on cooperation under anarchy, in which he's trying to think through the level of fear that exists in the international system, and he highlights two different conditions and gives them each sort of two possible toggles. So he describes a world in which offensive force has the advantage, in which states are better off attacking, versus a world in which defensive forces have the advantage, in which you'd rather be absorbing an attack and responding than you would be sort of trying to storm the castle and having the hot oil poured down on you. So that's one important factor. And obviously, if you're in an offense dominant world, you're going to live in much greater fear because your neighbors might attack you. And if they attack you, they're likely to be successful. Whereas if you live in a defense dominant world, you have much greater security because, yes, it's possible your neighbors could attack you, but that would be really unwise of them to do that, and you would have a fairly good chance of fighting them off. The second thing that Jervis highlights is thinking about specific military spending or specific military technology, and whether that technology can be differentiated in terms of whether it's for offensive use or not for offensive use. And so there are certain kinds of machinery that serve only one purpose, right? Like a long-range bomber. The only reason a state would ever want a long-range bomber is to fly far away and blow something up far away. That is an offensive weapon. You use that to attack. There's other technology that's far more ambiguous, right? A tank or artillery can be used for offense. You can use them as part of an attack, but you could also use them as part of your defense. And so it's unclear if when a state is spending on a tank or artillery units, what their intentions actually are. And so Jervis highlights this idea that, can you look at how a state is investing in their military, building a particular kind of ship or a particular kind of plane, and does that give you a clear insight into their intentions? And if it does, right, and you can tell if a state is planning for military operations, is planning to attack you, then that may put you in a world that's doubly dangerous, right, where they're planning to attack me, I can see it clearly. I'm sorry, I can't tell if they're planning to attack me, but I know that if they do attack me, I would be vulnerable to that. So that's a doubly dangerous world for Jervis, versus a world where you can tell if somebody is designing their military for offense or defense. In that scenario, if a state is designing for defense, even if offense has the advantage, you can sort of look at them and say, well, that's a problem, but that's the world we live in, and it doesn't look like they're trying to exploit my potential vulnerability. Whereas a state that is building an offensive military in a world that has offense for the advantage, that's a serious security problem, but you at least know it's coming. And you can at least identify and counter that, right? And so that's going to affect that parameter in your arms race model about whether you sort of go into alarm mode when a state is spending an extra dollar or whether you don't. Likewise, we can think about this distinguishing offense posture from defense posture in a world where defense has the advantage, right? If you can't distinguish, but defense has the advantage, well, you might be worried about your adversary and their spending because you can't tell what their intentions are, but you also aren't necessarily facing an existential threat. You're just facing a high level of uncertainty, but if you are attacked, you might have a reasonable chance of surviving that. Whereas if you live in a world where defense has the advantage and you can tell who's preparing for offensive action, then that military spending that your neighbor has, where they're building castles, is unlikely to create any sort of fear in you, and unlikely to spark a counter spending on your part, right? So if castles are the preeminent military technology, and I see that my neighbor is building a castle, I can look at that and say, well, castles are really terrible technology for attacking because they just sit there, and I don't care how much they spend on making their castle spectacularly effective as a military technology. It's not going to threaten me. And even if it did, I'm reasonably confident that my castles could repulse whatever attack that a state threw my way. That's a much better situation to be in. And so part of answering this question that I'll pose to folks, which is, does spending on icebreakers by states in the Arctic represent an arms race? Part of what I think we need to wrestle with that is to kind of ask ourselves, so what does that mean in terms of threat perception? What does that mean in increasing the vulnerability of states? What does it mean in terms of whether states are more or less likely to engage in military action? And then to think about how that feeds back into other things, the goals and ambitions that states have in the Arctic, which is something we talked a little bit about before when we talked about a geostrategic analysis of the Arctic, as well as sort of, does the spending on icebreakers to enhance naval capabilities in the Arctic or expeditionary capabilities in the Arctic really represent the kind of spending that's going to constrain a state, that's going to require breaks to kind of slow it down, or I guess trigger breaks to slow it down? Or is this something that could go on more or less indefinitely, with states increasing their icebreaker fleets the way we might expect with an arms race? And I don't have a good answer for this. I think I have a reasonable sense of where we're at, but it's kind of an open question. I'll leave it to folks to debate and discuss.